Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With this webinar series, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. Today, we have Bill McKelvey joining us to present about the impact that COVID-19 has on community food systems. Before I invite Bill to begin, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll close the webinar today with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected to today's webinar via your computer can submit any questions you have in the chat screen. So to open the chat, you can just click the chat button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you joined by phone today, then you can email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical difficulties, then please let me know by either submitting a note in the chat screen, or you can send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. Fourth, we will make a recorded version of the webinar available to you. You can look for an email from Zoom that shares more about where you can access that recorded copy in about a day from now. And last, in the chat screen today, I'll be sharing two different links during today's webinar. One will direct you to a sign-up form that you can use to enter your email and your name to sign up to receive future email announcements about Engaging for Missouri webinars. The second link that I'll share will direct you to a YouTube playlist where you can watch previously recorded Engaging for Missouri webinars. So now we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled Impact of COVID-19 on Community Food Systems. Presenting on this topic is Bill McKelvey, who is a senior project coordinator who works with our division's Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security and the Missouri Eats Community Engagement Program. So thank you, Bill, for being here today. If you could please start your video and unmute, then we can begin your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Alice. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to talk about this important topic. Primarily today, I'm going to be providing some examples along with some resources as it relates to the impact of COVID-19 on community food systems. I first want to give a shout out to my Missouri Eats team, So there's a small group of us within the Community Economic Development Program with MU Extension who've been developing this community engagement tool. So the overriding goal of this program is to help communities create healthy and resilient community-based food systems. And we do this very much in a community development style. So making sure that many different voices are heard and different stakeholders are involved to really help folks make a plan for their food system and really to enable them to transform different parts of their food system. And the really nice thing about this is communities get to decide. And so we feel like this is a highly relevant program, especially given recent developments related to COVID-19. We think there's going to be more interest in more kind of localized and regional food systems, and we are very hopeful about helping to spread this program around the state. And when I talk about community food systems today, I'm really talking about all of these different projects and activities and people and producers that go into helping to build a food system that is both profitable for farmers, that provides healthy food for communities, and that also protects the environment. So this is kind of a big picture sort of goal that we have with our Missouri Eats program, is to really help communities think about and build really strong and vibrant community-based food systems. So getting into the specifics of the presentation today, I'm going to be talking about impacts and resources as it relates to home and community gardens, producers, farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, produce auctions. We're going to talk a little bit about the emergency or the charitable food system, and then I have some additional sort of comments and sectors that I want to mention. And at the bottom of each slide, I do have sources. So when I'm speaking about different sort of impacts and resources, I've tried to source those to the best of my ability and provide links. And so, as Alice mentioned, these slides will be available in a PDF form after the presentation for you to go back and look at some of these resources in more detail. I want to first talk about how Missouri as a state has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic as it relates to food and farming and ag-related industries. So at the present time, Missouri food, farming, and ag-related industries are deemed critical infrastructure. And this is really following guidance from the federal government and the Department of Homeland Security. Our state has gone a step further in that Governor Parson has made a directive or a request along with the directors of Health and Senior Services and the Director of Ag, which further protects food and farming and ag industries in Missouri by removing the authority of local health agencies from closing or restricting the operations of a business that is a part of the food supply. So that sets a standard in our state. The good news with this, I believe, is that, first of all, it does ensure that our farmers and food producers can keep doing what they do, which is critically important during this time. I also think that, through some feedback that I've received, even though health departments cannot sort of restrict these businesses or operations, many groups, including producers and farmers markets and food pantries, have been working hand in hand with their local health department to make sure that the things that they are doing are meeting the current guidance as it relates to social distancing and COVID-19. So I think that's a real positive development. And I want to mention just briefly Kansas as an opportunity to sort of compare and contrast. I was on a call with the Kansas Vegetable Growers Association. What I learned on that call is that the governor in Kansas has not issued a similar directive for the state. And so in some cases, local health departments are either requesting that farmers markets don't open, or in some cases they have requested that farmers markets delay the open of their season. And it's created a real patchwork of responses to COVID-19. And I think it's created quite a bit of uncertainty for growers. So just want to kind of set the stage there with this important information. So moving on to the different sectors or elements of community-based food systems, I want to start with home and community gardens. So there's quite a bit of press right now, and some folks that I've talked to as well have talked about how people are really getting interested in growing their own food. So people are either trying to grow gardens for the first time, or they're trying to expand gardens. There's this term, the coronavirus victory garden. And so this has created, I would say, extra demand on a lot of our seed suppliers and our vegetable plant suppliers. And so that's something to be aware of. And I think this is actually an opportunity for us in Extension and in other organizations as well to think about, how do we provide resources for these folks who are new to gardening or wanting to grow more of their own food. In terms of community gardens, at least in Missouri, these would be protected under the governor's directive. And in my hometown of Columbia, Missouri, we have worked on guidance for community gardens and community gardeners, noting that gardens may stay open as long as they adhere to certain guidelines. And so we've asked that groups eliminate work days so they don't have a lot of people coming in and out of the garden or coming to the garden at one time. In terms of tools, we've asked that folks be vigilant about washing and sanitizing tools and any other types of shared equipment. I've heard of some gardens in other states where they've actually removed the tools. And so with the sources that I provided at the bottom of the page, you'll see a couple of different examples of how different groups have handled community gardens. Moving on to our producers and issues that they are facing. One thing that has come out of this is that the Food Safety Modernization Act was really quite timely and has proven to be very important during this pandemic. So most of the advice and direction that producers are getting is really very consistent with the Food Safety Modernization Act. So by and large, if farmers are following those guidelines, they're going to be doing the right thing as it relates to COVID-19. There are some additional recommendations, such as practicing social distancing, minimizing the number of touches on produce, and then also planning for change. So helping farmers think about, what would happen if the primary farmer or the farm owner became sick, or if a certain number of their workers became sick. What is their plan and how would they deal with that? On the marketing side, I think that's where it gets a lot more tricky. So farmers are having to think about alternative markets. And we'll talk about some of these a little bit later in the presentation, but a few of the examples that come to mind include this issue of farmers markets and whether or not they may open, and if they do open, will customer counts be up or down? Farmers are obviously exploring the world of online sales in combination with putting together market boxes, so where they would assemble orders from a person and then find some way to deliver those orders or drop them off at a central location. There's a lot of opportunity for co-op marketing with producers right now. So one producer that may already have some type of delivery system in place, adding products to their market box or to their CSA so that they can move product for other growers. And then for wholesalers and folks who are in farm to retail or farm to school, they're faced with this issue of what to do if their buyer is closed or priorities have changed. And so some growers are looking at redirecting to retail from more wholesale operation. And then also I found an example of a farm to food bank opportunity where a farmer actually created a fundraiser to pay for product to be donated to a food bank or a food pantry. So there's a ton of innovation going on right now. A couple of the sources that I provided, Oregon Tilth did a webinar featuring 5 different online platforms, and then also Happy Hollow Farm in Jamestown, Missouri, which serves the Columbia market, has added online ordering and this market box idea to their more traditional CSA. The world of farmers markets has changed as well. So many of them are looking at redesigning how they operate their farmers market. One model out there is to do a relatively typical farmers market, but with social distancing. I've seen some markets that have gone as far as to put tape in front of vendors' tables so that customers can't actually approach the table, but they have to point and have the farmer sort of bag and group the produce for them. They may designate a person who only handles cash or coins or credit cards so that that person is not also touching food. And there's other variations on that theme as well. Farmers markets have also been offering curbside pickup for pre-orders. So there's a couple of different ways that this is happening. In Columbia, there is, the Columbia Farmers Market has set up a system whereby customers would order directly from a particular vendor, and market staff would then help to assemble those orders, and then people would drive up to pick up their order and the order would be placed in their car. I learned about the Empire Market in Joplin. They're also going to online orders, but the market is doing more to sort of manage all of the orders, so people don't order from an individual vendor, but they're ordering from the market's website. In addition, Farmers Market of the Ozarks in Springfield has developed a drive-through farmers market system where customers actually drive through the farmers market by a vendor's table and they point or choose produce or other products as they drive through. So there's lots of different ideas out there, lots of creativity. A couple other resources are the National Farmers Market Coalition and the New York City Green Markets have quite a few examples as well. Community-supported agriculture is an area where the model itself actually has some built-in resilience. So, you know, in this model, members or customers tend to pay up front. They are essentially pre-ordering, and for the farmer, there is a guaranteed market. So this is a really positive sort of part of CSAs and how CSAs are already in some ways adapted to these current circumstances. For CSAs that require their members to come out and work on the farm, they're going to be facing a labor gap. And so they're going to have to do something about that. Many of them will likely have to redesign distribution. So if before they had their members pick their own produce and box their own produce, they might have to go to more of a market box system. And again, there's opportunity here for collaboration with other producers. And I provided a link here to the CSA Innovation Network, which has a really great resource. It's a working document that has a lot of information and other resources. I'll mention produce auctions. These are a pretty big deal in Missouri. According to the website that I looked at, Missouri has 8 produce auctions. There's a ton of produce that moves through these places. And this is primarily wholesale sales. And they are quite popular. And so they have developed guidance. So for example, I was able to learn about the Central Missouri Produce Auction and what they're doing in order to limit crowds at the produce auctions. So a lot of times these auctions tend to attract a lot of families and tourists. They've asked that families and tourists stay home, but only buyers and sellers attend. They also have a service whereby people can call in and place an order, and somebody at the auction will actually bid on produce for somebody. So you don't, as a buyer, even have to be present to buy produce there. So, and again, they've been working with their local health department at the Central Missouri Produce Auction to kind of vet some of these different ideas for maintaining safety. In terms of the emergency charitable food system, this is an area that I think could warrant an entire presentation. There's a lot of changes right now, and people had to really make changes very quickly. So food pantries and food banks are faced with increasing demand right now. So more people are demanding services and using services. They have a decrease in the number of volunteers who are showing up and who are able. A lot of food pantries are staffed by people who are 60 and over. And so they would likely have some concerns about being in a group of volunteers. In addition, food donations are down. And so food pantries have really had to adapt. They've had to change the way that volunteers interact with each other. And they've obviously had to change the way food is distributed. So I've heard of a lot of pantries who are using more of a drive-through method for distributing food. If, let's say, an agency used to do meals, they've gone more to brown bags. And so I think this is going to be a very sort of interesting area to watch, just because we know from past experience that even after a crisis subsides, there's a lot of people that still rely on food pantries. And so their numbers in terms of demand is probably going to be up for quite some time. I provided some additional links here. You know, obviously this is a pretty short presentation. It could be much longer, but I did want to mention UPIC. So that's a consideration as well. Kind of like the produce auctions, UPIC is sometimes a place for families to come out to enjoy the day. some UPIC producers that I've talked to are really trying to focus on limiting numbers and creating some system whereby people can still come and pick their own, but to really try to limit the crowds. Farm to school is another area that is affected. The National Farm to School Network has some resources. Food hubs as well would be affected. And I want to mention the Kansas City Food Hub, which has created a neighborhood farm share subscription program. So by and large, the Food Hub in Kansas City would sell mostly to sort of institutional buyers and other retail outlets and places like that. They've created this neighborhood program whereby if you can get 10 of your neighbors together, you can basically establish your own drop site for the Food Hub to come and provide weekly market boxes of produce. Known and Grown in St. Louis is another organization that is working to try to make information available about how to continue to connect with local producers during this time. And then I mentioned Growing for Market, which is an excellent publication that has a really nice article, really kind of focused on the producer side to help them kind of understand options and things like that. So with that, I think my time is up. I'll go ahead and pause for the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Bill. We do have a few questions that have been submitted. The first is, what are some sources for guidelines to incorporate on farms if volunteers or apprentices are on the farm, and so farms can keep everyone safe?
Well, I think that I'd have to look back through the resources specifically to see if there was something in there, but I think they would, you know, farms would follow, I guess, what would be sort of typical recommendations as it relates to employers who might still be open. So making sure that people are maintaining social distance, making sure that hand washing stations are available, definitely developing a system to reduce the number of touches on certain produce items. So I kind of feel like the guidance would really be very similar for other employers, or especially for produce growers who might have staff.
Great. You mentioned the victory garden trend that has popped up. Is there any sense of how many of people who are interested in these victory gardens are new to gardening? And then you mentioned how extension could fill a need here. What types of resources would you recommend that we make available to these people who are interested in gardening for the first time?
I don't think there's any data right now showing how many of these gardeners would be new gardeners. That's kind of still to be known. But I think that in terms of resources, you know, the first one that comes to mind is the Missouri Master Gardener Program. So we have trained master gardeners all across the state who could, I think, be engaged in different types of educational opportunities. Now, given the social distancing guidelines, it's likely that those are going to have to be online and using some type of remote technology. So kind of like the rest of us, that whole format is going to have to change. But I think, you know, master gardeners are a really great resource for communities and new gardeners to engage with.
Sure. Yeah, great thought. How do community gardens control vandalism or theft?
Well, that's an ongoing issue. And, you know, some gardens put up a fence, but a fence is really not kind of a foolproof barrier. You know, to me, the best opportunity for vandalism and theft, or to control vandalism and theft, is to really make friends with your neighbors at a community garden. So the more eyes and ears you have on that garden, the more likely somebody is going to speak up and say something if they see something going on that doesn't look quite right. So I think really building community is the best defense against theft and vandalism. And then second, offense.
So to what extent might self-serve markets be an option for farms that have lost other markets but are still looking for a direct-to-consumer distribution channel?
So by self-serve markets, I assume we're talking about farm stands.
Yes. Yes.
So I think farm stands could be an opportunity, although the idea of self-serve might not be in compliance with recommendations. So if we look at how a lot of the farmers markets are changing what they do, they are not letting people serve themselves. So there would have to be a staff member on hand to basically sort of pack produce or to fill orders or to fill bags for customers. And so I think, folks would kind of have to think about how to design that so that individuals are not going up and touching a lot of produce.
Sure. Where might you recommend that growers get information on how to share to consumers to keep their produce safe? So in terms of like cleaning produce, to disinfect it and things like that, what kind of resources are available for people?
So MU Extension and K-State Extension share a food safety specialist. Her name is Londa Nauticki. She's done some excellent trainings in the past, and there are some trainings that are upcoming specifically for producers on this topic of food safety. So on one of my previous slides where I talk about food safety, there is a link to a K-State Extension website that has a lot of resources. It also has links to the events that will be upcoming for producers. And so I would say that producers could learn a lot by being a part of one of those webinars that are coming up.
Great, yeah. So for dairy producers, the loss of selling milk in the school lunch program has created some problems. Milk dumping is something that's going on throughout the country. Do you have any thoughts on what's going to happen to milk producers if this continues?
That is a really good question, and I did not look into issues related to dairy. So that is something that I'm not really able to speak to, but it is a very good question.
Sure. So another question is, to what extent, if any, have food banks adopted new rules or practices governing what types of fresh food they're willing to accept to distribute to their constituents?
So my understanding is that, so I'm not aware of any sort of specific guidance related to fresh food, although there may be some out there. What I have seen in the communications that I've received from a few different food banks is that they are in some ways discouraging food donations in general, just because you can imagine whether it's a piece of produce or whether it's a can from somebody's pantry, somebody is going to have to touch that, and then there's a potential to transfer the virus through any type of food product. So they are, in general, encouraging folks to donate money because in some ways they can make that money go further than, say, a donation of food. And I should also mention, and I picked this up in some of the food safety presentations that I've been a part of, there's not a lot of evidence that this virus is spread through food. So it's wise to take all of these precautions, and it makes sense to do so. But it's also important to keep in mind kind of the latest thinking and research in terms of how the virus is transmitted. And everything that I've read indicates that it is not likely spread through food. So that's just something to keep in mind as well.
Right. I will note to everyone that Londa just included a comment here in your chat screen where you can go and access some resources about food safety, and they're recommending that people still just wash their produce with running water, even in light of the COVID-19 epidemic. So there is some good information there in the chat screen to make note of. Bill, we have time for one more question, and this relates to food security. So you're with the Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security, and at the end of last year, you shared, or released rather, the Missouri Hunger Atlas, which found that about 15% of Missourians are food insecure. How do you anticipate food insecurity changing given unemployment and other economic indicators that have been released here recently?
I think it will most definitely go up. So we will see higher rates of food insecurity in Missouri and across the country. The distribution of food insecurity will likely be uneven, kind of like it is now, how we have places in the state Central Ozarks region, Southeast Missouri, parts of Northern Missouri, and our metropolitan areas that tend to be most affected. The challenge with this data is that we probably won't know for a couple of years, in terms of the real impact, but I do believe that we will see an increase in food insecurity.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, Bill, so much for presenting today. And thank you to our audience too. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you could please consider responding to that survey, we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded version of today's webinar via email within about a day from now. And also within that email, we'll have a link to the PDF copy of the slides that Bill shared today. So on Monday, we'll have Kevin Gabbert with FCS Financial here to present an Engaging for Missouri webinar focused on working with your lender during uncertain times. So we hope that you join us then. We will plan to send out registration links for next week's webinars later today. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Bill, and have a great afternoon and a great weekend.